So this is the one?
They looked at her cheap dress, then at each other and smiled. "So this is the one?" the mother asked softly. The son tried to speak, but the woman beside him only lowered her eyes and held her little handbag tighter. "Maybe I should leave," she whispered. "No," he said quickly. But by then the damage had already begun. In a room filled with wealth, pride, and quiet cruelty, one small moment was about to open the door to a heartbreak nobody saw coming. Hello, beautiful people, welcome back. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and leave a like. It means everything to us. Please share this video with someone you care about and switch on post notifications so you won't miss any future videos. Also, comment where you're watching from. Thank you for always supporting. Now, relax and let's begin. Victoria Cole lived in a small, neat apartment on a quiet street where nobody looked twice at her. Every morning she swept her own balcony, watered two potted plants, and left home in simple dresses that made her look like any other modest young woman trying to survive the city. The neighbors knew her as polite, reserved, and punctual. They never saw drivers waiting downstairs or assistants calling for schedules because she never allowed that life near this place. Here, she was simply Victoria. She liked the silence, the ordinary rhythm, the feeling of being unobserved. In that hidden simplicity, she felt closer to peace than power. Across town, Stanley Vaughn sat in his father's polished office, staring at figures that refused to improve. The leather chairs, framed awards, and shining floors still suggested success, but the air felt heavy with secrets. Paul Vaughn kept saying, "It is a temporary setback," while shuffling papers with practiced calm. Sandra still planned social events as though appearances could hold the family together. Justina laughed loudly about shopping trips and social media, untouched by the tension. But Stanley felt every crack. He carried his family's expectations like stones inside his chest. Surrounded by elegance, he felt tired in a way comfort could not fix, and lonely in a house full of voices. Victoria met Stanley on a rainy afternoon in a small bookstore cafe tucked between two old buildings. She had reached for the same book he wanted, and both pulled back with apologetic smiles. "You can have it," Stanley said, weary but gentle. "No, please, you saw it first," Victoria replied. Something in her calm voice made him pause. They ended up sharing the tiny table by the window because the cafe was full and the rain showed no sign of stopping. Their conversation began with books, drifted to music, then to the strange comfort of quiet places. For the first time in days, Stanley forgot to look at his phone.
I'm so glad we could meet.
Me too. It's nice to finally talk.
Victoria noticed he did not introduce himself with pride or speak like a man who expected admiration. He listened carefully, answered honestly, and even laughed at himself. That alone made him different from the polished men who had once circled her because of her surname and influence. Stanley noticed her simplicity, but it did not feel dull. It felt restful. "You seem peaceful," he said before thinking. Victoria smiled faintly. "That is because I protect my peace." The answer stayed with him long after the rain stopped. When they stepped outside, he hesitated, then asked, "Can I see you again?" Victoria looked at him for a moment and softly said, "Maybe." That day, Stanley found reasons to return to the bookstore cafe, and Victoria, though cautious, kept showing up. Their connection did not burst into romance. It unfolded slowly, like a song that becomes beautiful because it never hurries itself. He began telling her about his long days without numbing the family pressure behind them. She spoke little about herself, but when she did, her words carried unusual thoughtfulness. Stanley found comfort in her silences. She never rushed to impress him or fill every moment. Sometimes they sat with tea and watched people pass outside. In her presence, his shoulders relaxed and his mind grew quiet. Victoria had promised herself never to trust too quickly, yet Stanley's gentleness made that promise harder to keep. He did not chase glamour, and he seemed grateful for simple moments. He asked what made her happy, not what she owned. He noticed when she looked tired, when she needed space, when she smiled with real warmth instead of politeness. But there were small signs too. He avoided conflict in stories about work, softened difficult truths, and often said, "I just want peace." Victoria heard those words and stored them carefully in her heart. Peace was beautiful, yes, but sometimes peace was another name for fear, and fear had destroyed love before. Far from the modest apartment, another world waited for Victoria. At the top floor of a sleek glass tower, executives stood when she entered boardrooms. Investors watched her closely, and entire companies shifted direction at her approval. She was the quiet force behind one of the largest family-owned investment groups in the region, a woman whose decisions shaped futures and fortunes. But that world never entered her small apartment unless she invited it. Even the staff who served her in private residences knew never to mention luxury around outsiders. She had built those boundaries carefully. Wealth had once brought admiration, but never certainty. She wanted to know who could see her without the golden frame. Ken Cole, her cousin and most trusted executive, visited that evening carrying a file and a worried expression. "You are smiling too much these days," he said lightly, setting the folder down. Victoria laughed. "Is that now a crime?" Ken sat opposite her and lowered his voice. "Only when I know what caused it. Victoria, please be careful. Men become different when they learn who you are." Her smile faded. "I know," she said. "That is why he does not know." Ken studied her face. "And if this becomes serious?" Victoria looked out the window. "Then I will finally know whether he chose me first or what comes with me." Vaughn family still looked impressive from the outside. Sandra hosted elegant brunches, wore confidence like perfume, and spoke as though the world still bowed to the Vaughn name. Paul dressed impeccably, attended meetings with old charm, and insisted that slow seasons came to every business. Justina moved through life with sharp jokes and expensive taste, convinced that status was both shield and identity. Their home gleamed with polished marble and curated beauty, but beneath the surface, anxiety moved quietly from room to room. Bills were delayed, trusted partners were becoming cautious, and the family business was no longer as secure as their pride wanted others to believe. Stanley felt trapped between love for his family and disappointment in the way they measured everything. At dinner, Sandra would say, "In times like these, people must marry wisely." Paul would nod and answer, "Connections matter more when survival is on the line." Justina added careless remarks about wealthy daughters of powerful men, treating marriage like a business transaction. Stanley often went silent. He wanted to believe he was different from them, but he had lived too long under their roof, under their expectations, under the quiet rule that family came before personal comfort. Sometimes he wondered whether he was strong enough to choose his own life if choosing it meant disappointing everyone else. One evening, after a long walk through a quiet park, Stanley stopped beneath a jacaranda tree and turned to Victoria with unusual seriousness. "There is a party at our house this weekend," he said. "It is my mother's event. I want you to come." Victoria looked at him without answering immediately. The invitation sounded simple, but both of them knew it was not. To be introduced to family meant crossing from private sweetness into public judgment. Stanley read the hesitation in her face and added, "You do not have to impress anyone, just come as yourself." Victoria smiled faintly. "That may be the part they find hardest." That night, Ken called after seeing the invitation in her calendar. "You are actually going?" he asked. "Yes," Victoria answered, "but exactly as I am living." Ken sighed. No car from the company, no visible staff, no revealing anything. "Nothing," she said firmly. "If this family is meant to become part of my life, let me see their hearts before they see my name." She chose a modest dress, a simple handbag, and low heels with no designer marks. Looking at herself in the mirror, she seemed almost ordinary. Yet behind her calm eyes was a woman walking deliberately into a test that might either bless her future or break it. The Vaughn home glowed with warm lights, polished silver, and carefully arranged flowers. Guests moved through the hall in expensive fabrics, speaking loudly, laughing quickly, and measuring one another with practiced ease. Stanley welcomed Victoria at the entrance with genuine warmth, but the moment Sandra saw her, something cooled in her expression. Victoria looked lovely but understated, too understated for a family that viewed appearance as announcement. She greeted Sandra respectfully. "Good evening, ma'am." Sandra smiled with her lips, not her eyes. "Welcome." Justina, standing nearby, looked Victoria over from head to toe and said nothing, but her silence was full of opinion. Victoria felt it all immediately and remained poised. As the evening unfolded, questions started floating toward her with polished cruelty. "What line of work are you in?" one aunt asked. "Something small and private," Victoria replied. "And your family?" another guest pressed. "We live quietly," she said with a soft smile. Each modest answer deepened their assumptions. Sandra noticed the plain handbag, the absence of jewelry, the lack of recognizable labels. To her, Victoria did not merely seem simple, she seemed unsuitable. Stanley stayed near her when he could, but he kept being pulled away by guests and business associates. Left alone in clusters of elegant strangers, Victoria realized that wealth did not always make rooms beautiful. Sometimes it only made judgment more polished. Victoria stepped onto the terrace for air and heard voices drifting from the side corridor. Sandra's tone was low but clear. "Stanley, where exactly did you find that girl?" Stanley answered, embarrassed. "Mother, please, her name is Victoria," Sandra sighed. "That is not the point. Look at her, Stanley. She does not fit this family." A softer laugh followed, and Justina added, "At least she looks humble enough to learn. That should count for something." Another cousin joined in. "These quiet girls are always watching rich sons." The words were not shouted, yet they landed harder because they were spoken so casually, as though her dignity were too small to deserve caution. Victoria stood still, one hand resting on the cold railing, and for a moment she felt the old ache she thought she had long mastered. She had entered the party hopping for discomfort, perhaps skepticism, but hearing herself reduced to a class assumption reopened an older wound. Stanley noticed her later and asked, "Are you all right?" She nodded, wearing a gentle smile that cost her more than anyone knew. "I am fine." He leaned closer. "Please do not mind them, they can be difficult." Victoria looked at him carefully. She wanted him to say more, to defend her, to be offended on her behalf. Instead, he only apologized softly and led her back inside. After the party, Stanley drove Victoria home through quiet streets washed in orange light. The air between them felt tender and strained at once. "I am sorry," he said again, hands tight on the steering wheel. "My family can be proud, but they will come around." Victoria looked out the window before replying. "Maybe," Stanley glanced at her. "You do not believe me." She turned back to him with a sad smile. "I believe you want peace." He frowned slightly. "What is wrong with peace?" Victoria's voice stayed soft. "Nothing, unless peace is just another way of avoiding the truth." Stanley fell silent, hearing more in her words than she openly said. When they reached her apartment, Stanley got out and walked her to the door. He touched her hand gently. "I care about you, Victoria. Please do not let tonight ruin this." For a moment she wanted to step closer and believe him fully. Instead, she asked quietly, "If someone insults the person you care about, do you comfort them after or protect them while it is happening?" Stanley looked wounded, but he had no ready answer. That unsettled her more than the party itself. She went upstairs smiling politely, then shut the door and leaned against it in silence. The evening had not ended in disaster, yet something important had already begun to crack. Even after the party, Stanley did not withdraw. If anything, he tried harder. He took Victoria to simple places where life felt honest, small restaurants with soft music, roadside tea stands after evening drives, quiet corners of the park where children laughed in the distance. He spoke more openly now about the pressure of being the son expected to hold everything together. "Sometimes I feel like a bridge everyone is walking on," he confessed one evening. Victoria listened carefully. "And who carries the bridge?" Stanley laughed sadly. "No one, I suppose." She looked at him with gentle warmth, and in that moment he felt more understood than he had in years. Victoria could see the goodness in him more clearly than ever, and that made her growing fear more painful. Stanley was kind, thoughtful, and sincere in private. He remembered small details, spoke gently, and never treated her like an ornament. Yet the weakness remained beneath all that tenderness. He hated displeasing people. He softened hard lines until they almost disappeared. When conflict approached, his instinct was not to stand firm but to soothe, delay, and hope for balance. Victoria noticed it each time he said, "Let me handle it carefully," instead of, "This is wrong." Still, love continued growing, not because she was blind, but because hearts sometimes grow even where caution is whispering. A week later, Sandra invited Victoria to lunch at an upscale restaurant. Stanley called it a positive sign. She would not do that if she did not want to know you better, he said hopefully. Victoria accepted, though her instincts were quiet and watchful. Sandra arrived elegant and smiling, complimented Victoria's dress, and asked about her day with perfect manners. But the warmth lasted only minutes. Soon the questions sharpened. "So tell me, dear, what exactly do you earn from this private work of yours?" Sandra asked, stirring her tea. "Enough to live simply," Victoria replied. Sandra smiled. "Yes, but simplicity is easier when one has no larger responsibilities." The conversation deepened into polished humiliation. Sandra asked where Victoria's parents were buried, who had sponsored her education, whether she had any property, and whether she understood the social obligations of joining a family like theirs. Every question sounded civilized, but each one quietly reduced Victoria into a financial profile. Victoria answered calmly, refusing embarrassment the satisfaction of visibility. "I value peace, hard work, and loyalty," she said at one point. Sandra set her cup down with delicate emphasis. "Lovely values, but values alone do not build legacy." Victoria met her gaze. "Sometimes they are the only thing that can keep one from destroying it." For the first time, Sandra's smile tightened, and silence briefly sat between them. At home, the Vaughn family continued performing prosperity with almost desperate skill. Caterers still arrived for dinners, expensive cars still lined the driveway, and Sandra still supervised decorations as though elegance alone could silence unpaid obligations. Paul spent longer hours locked in his study, taking calls in a lower tone than before. Stanley saw envelopes disappear into drawers and heard fragments of tense conversations about creditors, renegotiations, and delayed transfers. Yet every time he raised concern openly, his father said, "These things happen in business. Panic is for amateurs." Sandra always added, "What matters is that no one sees weakness." In that family, image was treated almost like oxygen. Victoria saw the strain settling deeper into Stanley's face. One evening, while they sat on a quiet bench overlooking the water, she asked, "Why do you carry things that are not all yours to carry?" Stanley smiled weakly. "Because if I do not, everything may fall apart." Victoria studied him. "Sometimes things fall apart because too many people are pretending they are not breaking." He looked at her then, tired and thoughtful. "You always say simple things that sound bigger later." She smiled. "Maybe because truth does not need decoration." Stanley held her hand, grateful for the comfort but not yet ready to hear the full meaning. He still believed effort alone could protect his family from consequence. The next family gathering was smaller, more intimate, and somehow more painful. Justina, no longer pretending politeness, moved close to Victoria during dessert and said sweetly, "You should let me help you find a better apartment someday. Stanley says yours is tiny." Several people nearby laughed softly. Victoria set down her spoon carefully. "It is enough for me," she replied. Justina tilted her head. "Of course, some people are used to small spaces." Then with a brighter smile, she added, "I just hope my brother is not being followed by someone who sees comfort and mistakes it for love." The table quieted, but no one immediately corrected her. That silence spoke louder than the insult. Stanley finally said, "Justina, stop it." But his voice was restrained, more embarrassed than outraged. Justina shrugged. "I am only being honest." Victoria felt the sting more deeply than she expected, not because the accusation was new, but because the family's silence wrapped around it like permission. She rose calmly and excused herself. Outside, under the soft porch light, Stanley followed her. "Please, she was out of line," he said. Victoria turned to him, eyes gentle but wounded. "Yes, she was." He waited for anger, tears, or even blame. Instead, she simply asked, "Why do wrong things become smaller in your mouth when they come from your family?" Stanley had no answer that could heal what had just happened. Ken noticed the change in Victoria before she admitted anything. She was quieter on calls, slower to smile, more often lost in thought. He found her in her office one evening staring at the city lights below. "You are hurting," he said plainly. Victoria did not deny it. "He is not cruel, Ken." Ken nodded. "I never said he was." Sometimes weakness wounds more deeply than cruelty because it keeps hopping to be forgiven. His words settled heavily between them. Victoria sat down and rubbed her hands together. I wanted this one to be different. Ken pulled a chair closer. And maybe he is different, but different is not always enough to build a life. Victoria defended Stanley even while her certainty thinned. She spoke of his kindness, his honesty in private moments, the softness with which he listened. Ken heard her out, then said gently, "You are describing a good heart. I am asking whether he has a strong one." She closed her eyes briefly. The question followed her long after he left. In memory, she replayed the party, the lunch, the dinner, the hesitations. Stanley always looked sorry. He always tried to soothe, but he had not truly stood. Love, she was learning again, could feel warm and still be unsafe. She hated that realization because by then she had already begun to imagine a future. Sandra was no longer subtle about her plans. At breakfast one morning, she placed a photo beside Stanley's plate. "You remember her," she said, "daughter of the Ibrahims, educated, graceful, and from a family that still understands alliances." Stanley barely glanced at the picture. "Mother, no." Sandra folded her napkin neatly. "You say no now because you are thinking emotionally. Your father needs support. This family needs stability." Paul, seated at the head of the table, said without looking up, "A wise marriage can solve more than romance ever will." Stanley stared at him in disbelief. "So that is what this has become," Sandra replied. "It became that the day reality arrived." Suggestion unsettled Stanley more than he admitted. He rejected the idea aloud, yet the pressure behind it seeped into him. For the first time, he saw his relationship with Victoria being weighed openly against business survival. He hated it, but he did not storm away or draw a clear line. Instead, he carried the conversation with him like a hidden wound. Later, when he met Victoria, he was quieter than usual. She noticed immediately. "What happened?" she asked. Stanley forced a smile. "Nothing I cannot handle." Victoria looked at him steadily. "Some silences are louder than words, Stanley." He wanted to tell her everything, but fear and shame tangled his honesty before it could fully form. A few days later, Stanley asked Victoria to meet him by the waterfront at sunset, a place that had once felt easy for them. This time, his shoulders were tense, his voice uncertain. They walked slowly until he stopped near the railing. "Victoria," he began, "if things became very difficult for my family, could you really live that kind of life with me?" She stared at him, not because the idea of hardship frightened her, but because the question revealed where his heart had gone under pressure. Rushed to explain. "I do not mean it badly. I just mean if everything changed, if we lost comfort, position, all of it, could you stay?" Victoria answered without hesitation. "Yes." Her voice was soft but firm enough to make him look up. Then she asked the question that mattered more. "If I had nothing, Stanley, if your family rejected me, mocked me, and saw no benefit in me, would you still stand beside me fully?" Stanley said. "Of course I would." But the words arrived with a tremor of doubt. It was not the content of his answer that wounded her. It was the hesitation, the visible calculation, the brief shadow of fear in his eyes. In that small pause, Victoria heard the truth he could not say cleanly. He loved her, but not with the courage needed to protect her from the storm around him. Victoria went home carrying a heartbreak too quiet for the world to notice. She greeted the doorman, climbed the stairs, entered her apartment, and only when the door closed behind her did her calm face finally break. She sat on the edge of her bed and cried without sound, tears falling steadily into her hands. What hurt her was not the absence of love. Stanley loved her. She knew that. But love that trembled at the edge of pressure could not be trusted with a future. She had hidden her wealth to test for greed. She had not expected to discover something sadder, a man whose heart was tender, yet too easily bent. Ken came by later after one of her assistants quietly called him. He found Victoria standing by the kitchen counter with untouched tea. "He asked me if I could survive losing everything," she said before he spoke. Ken looked at her carefully. "And what did you hear behind the question?" She gave a broken laugh. "That he was already imagining me as a burden instead of a partner." Ken moved closer. "I am sorry." Victoria wiped her tears and whispered, "Do you know what hurts most? Not rejection, not insult. It is realizing someone loves you but not bravely enough." Ken did not argue. Some truths were too painful for comfort, and this was one of them. Sandra arrived at Victoria's apartment building on a bright afternoon, the kind of day that made everything look gentler than it really was. She carried a small envelope and wore the expression of a woman who believed she had come to settle something unpleasant but necessary. Victoria welcomed her in politely and offered tea. Sandra declined. Her eyes moved across the modest furniture, the simple curtains, the clean little room, and what she saw only confirmed her assumptions. "I will speak plainly," Sandra said, taking a seat without being asked twice. "You seem decent enough, but you are not suitable for my son's world. This will save everyone time." She placed the envelope on the table and nudged it forward. "Take this. Leave Stanley peacefully. Build your life elsewhere." Victoria looked at it, then at Sandra with calm disbelief. "You brought money?" Sandra lifted her chin. "Call it help, call it wisdom, call it mercy before matters become uglier." Victoria's voice remained steady. "I do not want your money." Sandra misunderstood the refusal immediately. "If the amount is too small, I can," Victoria interrupted softly. "The problem is not the amount. It is the insult." Sandra rose, mildly irritated. "Women from your level should know when they are out of place." Victoria met her gaze. "And some people never realize how little they understand the rooms they walk into." Sandra's visit, Victoria did not tell Stanley what had happened. Part of her wanted to see whether he would ever confront the growing cruelty around them without being forced by fresh evidence. Instead, she grew quieter. Calls became shorter. Smiles came later and faded sooner. Stanley noticed the shift at once and tried to repair it with kindness. He sent flowers, suggested dinner, and asked, "Did I do something?" Victoria would answer, "Not one thing, many small things." But he did not understand. Or perhaps he did, and understanding frightened him because it required a strength he had not yet found. Their love did not shatter, it slowly began to ache. Stanley, meanwhile, felt himself being pulled in opposite directions until he could hardly hear his own convictions. At home, Sandra spoke about duty. Paul spoke about survival. Justina mocked Victoria whenever the chance appeared. With Victoria, the world felt honest, but honesty now demanded action. Instead of taking that action, Stanley kept trying to manage everything. "Give me time," he told Victoria. "I can fix this." She looked at him with tired tenderness. Not everything can be fixed by waiting. He reached for her hand, but even his touch felt uncertain. The tragedy of their love was becoming clearer each day. Both hearts were present, yet only one was prepared to suffer for the truth. Victoria asked Stanley to meet her at the same bookstore cafe where they had first shared a table on a rainy afternoon. The place was quiet, almost tender in its familiarity, which made what came next feel even more painful. Stanley arrived hopeful, carrying the smile of a man who believed difficult things could still be mended. But one look at Victoria's face told him something had already changed beyond repair. She folded her hands on the table and said softly, "Stanley, I cannot keep walking toward a home I would have to protect alone." He frowned, confused and afraid. "What are you saying?" She held his gaze. "Love without courage cannot protect a home." The words struck him harder than anger would have. "Victoria, please," he said, leaning forward. "I love you." She nodded, tears brightening her eyes. "I know." "Then do not do this." Her voice shook but remained gentle. "You love me, but you keep asking me to survive what you should be standing against." Stanley reached for her hand, desperate now. "Just give me more time." Victoria slowly withdrew her fingers. Time does not turn fear into courage by itself. When she left the cafe, there was no scene, no harshness, only quiet heartbreak. Back at home, Sandra assumed the problem had resolved itself. But Stanley returned looking like a man who had misplaced part of his soul. Sandra received news of the breakup with hidden satisfaction she did not bother disguising for long. "It is for the best," she told Paul that evening while arranging flowers in the sitting room. "That girl would never have survived this family." Justina was less restrained. "I told you she would leave once she realized she could not climb fast enough," she said with a careless laugh. Paul barely responded, too buried in his own worries. To them, Victoria's exit confirmed every shallow judgment they had made. They believed her simplicity meant fragility, her silence meant weakness, and her departure meant ambition defeated. None of them saw that dignity sometimes leaves quietly because it has already seen enough. Stanley, however, felt no relief at all. He moved through the house with a heaviness that unsettled even the staff. He stopped arguing at dinner, stopped correcting Justina, stopped pretending optimism in meetings. He would pick up his phone to message Victoria, then put it back down because every sentence seemed smaller than what he had failed to do. One night Paul found him standing alone on the balcony and said, "You are too emotional about this." Stanley answered without looking at him, "No, I was not emotional enough at the right time." That was the first honest thing he had said to his family in weeks, and even then, it changed nothing. The real collapse did not come dramatically at first. It came through canceled agreements, cold replies from former allies, and numbers that stopped obeying hopeful language. Then one morning everything seemed to arrive at once. A major partner withdrew. A lender demanded immediate restructuring. Rumors began spreading quietly through the market. Paul's office, once a place of controlled authority, became a room of urgent calls and closed doors. Stanley read the reports with growing alarm. The company was no longer merely strained. It was in danger. The elegant world Sandra had guarded so fiercely was beginning to tilt, and no amount of polished hosting could steady it. Panic moved through the Vaughn household in different forms. Paul became sharper, losing his temper over minor mistakes. Sandra grew irritable and restless, asking repeatedly who had been informed and what the press might hear. Justina, for once, stopped making jokes and asked in a smaller voice, "Are we truly in trouble?" Stanley buried himself in meetings, trying to help, but he soon realized how much had been hidden from him. "Why was I not told it had become this bad?" he asked Paul. His father rubbed his forehead and said, "Because I kept thinking I could still turn it around." The family that had mocked modesty was now staring directly at ruin. Just when the situation seemed to be closing in from all sides, a formal acquisition proposal arrived from an unnamed buyer represented by a respected legal firm. The offer was strict but strangely thoughtful. It promised immediate stabilization, protection for employees, preservation of key operations, and a structured transition that would keep public disgrace to a minimum. Paul read it twice, suspicious of generosity in a market that had become merciless. Sandra's first reaction was outrage. "Anonymous," she snapped. "We are not handing this family name to faceless people." But the numbers in front of them were clear. Without intervention, the company might not survive the quarter. Pride was becoming an expensive luxury. Stanley studied the proposal more carefully than the others. Beneath its firmness, he sensed unusual intelligence. Whoever had designed it understood not just finance but also people. Jobs were protected. Humiliation was minimized. There was even space for existing leadership to remain involved under new terms. "This is not an attack," he said quietly. "It looks like a rescue." Sandra turned on him. "Do not sound grateful. We have not met them." Paul remained silent for a long moment before saying, "We will take the meeting." The decision hung in the room like surrender wrapped in strategy. None of them knew that the future walking toward them had a familiar voice and remembered everything. On the other side of the city, Victoria sat at the head of a long conference table with Ken and her executive team. The Vaughn files lay open before them, marked with notes, projections, and revised structures she had personally approved. She had known about the company's decline long before the public signs began showing. At first, she had said nothing. Hopping distance would be enough. But when she saw how many workers depended on the business, she chose intervention. "No unnecessary damage," she told the room. "We are preserving livelihoods, not punishing employees for executive pride." Her tone was calm, professional, and almost severe in its clarity. After the team left, Ken remained behind. "Last chance to hand this to someone else," he said. Victoria looked at him, then back at the city skyline beyond the glass. "No," he leaned against the table. "You are sure this is not about him?" she answered honestly. "It is partly about him. Not the man who failed me, but the man I once believed he could become." Ken watched her face soften and harden in the same breath. Victoria continued, "I am not saving their pride. I am saving staff who did nothing wrong, families who rely on their salaries, and whatever remains in Stanley that deserves one final act of mercy." The headquarters of the anonymous buyer rose above the city like a quiet statement of power. Its glass walls reflected the morning light so cleanly that Sandra felt smaller the moment she stepped out of the car. Staff greeted them with respectful efficiency, but the scale of the place unsettled her. This was not the office of a desperate opportunist. It was the domain of someone established, careful, and unquestionably powerful. Paul tried to recover confidence by straightening his jacket and speaking in his old commanding tone. Stanley said little. He had felt uneasy since reading the offer, as though something unspoken had already entered the story and was waiting inside. As they walked toward the boardroom, Sandra whispered, "Remember who we are." Paul nodded, though less firmly than usual. Justina, unusually quiet, looked around with wide eyes. Stanley's gaze lingered on details others missed: the precision of the staff, the respect in the corridors, the sense that everyone here trusted the person at the center. "Whoever runs this place is not ordinary," he murmured. Paul answered, "Then we negotiate carefully." The boardroom doors stood ahead, tall and polished. A receptionist opened them with a gentle smile. "They are ready for you now." None of them were prepared for the truth waiting on the other side, seated already in calm authority. When the doors opened, Stanley forgot how to breathe for a moment. At the head of the table sat Victoria, dressed in elegant simplicity that needed no display to announce power. Ken sat beside her, along with senior executives and legal advisors who turned toward the Vaughns only after she did. She was not standing nervously in some reception corner. She was not visiting as someone's assistant. She was the center of the room. The room moved with her permission. Sandra stopped mid-step. Paul's face went pale. Justina actually whispered, "No." Stanley remained frozen, staring at the woman he had once walked home from cafes, now seated where only the most powerful belonged. Victoria rose slowly, not to intimidate, but because manners were still part of her nature. "Good morning," she said, as though this were an ordinary meeting. Her voice was calm, but its steadiness made the silence in the room even heavier. Sandra opened her mouth, closed it, then finally managed, "Victoria." Ken answered before Victoria could. "Ms. Cole is the principal decision-maker regarding this acquisition." Paul gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. Stanley's eyes remained fixed on her face, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. The woman they had dismissed, judged, insulted, and pushed aside was the billionaire behind the only rescue they had left. Once everyone was seated, Victoria began speaking with measured clarity. She explained that the modest apartment they had imagined as her only world was one of several private residences she kept for peace. She said her simple dresses were choices, not limitations. She had hidden her surname, her business identity, and her wealth because she was tired of being evaluated before she was known. "I wanted honesty," she said, looking first at Paul, then Sandra, then finally Stanley. "I wanted to know whether I could be welcomed into a family for my character, not my influence. I wanted to be loved without the noise that money brings." No one interrupted her. Shame had made listeners of them all. Then her voice softened, and that softness hurt more than anger could have. "Before things ended, I had already asked my team to design a structure that could support your company discreetly. Stanley would have remained in a dignified leadership role. Your family would have had room to recover with respect." Sandra stared at her, stunned. Paul lowered his head. Victoria continued, "I made those plans because I loved him, not because I needed anything from this family." She turned to Stanley then, and his regret became visible in his eyes. "But love offered no safety here. What I saw instead was arrogance, silence, and fear." The room felt smaller under the weight of the truth they had refused to imagine. Victoria slid the revised agreement across the table with calm hands. "The company will be stabilized," she said. "Employees will remain protected, key departments will continue, and the brand may survive under a new structure. But the Vaughn family will no longer retain controlling power." Sandra made a broken sound of protest, but Ken gently pointed her toward the clauses already explained by counsel. Paul read in silence, his shoulders slowly sinking. Stanley looked through the pages and saw that Victoria had done exactly what she promised: firm, fair, and almost painfully merciful. She had not designed a humiliation. She had designed accountability. That difference made the moment harder to endure. Then came the part that struck Stanley most deeply. Victoria said, "You will not be removed, Stanley. You will be offered a role based on your actual ability, not family entitlement. You may choose to earn your place." He looked at her in disbelief. After everything, she was still leaving him dignity. Sandra turned toward Victoria with tears she could no longer hold back. "Why would you still do this for him?" Victoria answered quietly. "Because I once loved him. And because innocent people should not lose their livelihood because pride ruled this family for too long." Sandra wept then, not only for the business, but because she finally understood that her greed had cost her son both love and legacy. After the meeting, Stanley asked if he could speak to Victoria alone. She agreed, and they stood together in a quiet office overlooking the city, the distance between them filled with all that had been said too late. For a long moment, Stanley said nothing. Then his composure gave way. "I loved you," he said, voice low and unsteady. "I still do. That part was always true." Victoria looked at him with tired tenderness. "I know," he swallowed hard, "but I was weak. I kept hoping I could keep everyone calm, keep peace, keep you, keep my family, and I did not see that every delay was its own choice." His honesty came late, but it came bare. Victoria's eyes filled, though her voice remained steady. "Love is not only what we feel when things are quiet, Stanley. Love is also what we choose when standing firm will cost us comfort." He nodded slowly, tears slipping free now. "I should have protected you." Victoria answered, "Yes." The simplicity of that truth made him close his eyes in pain. She continued more softly, "You were not cruel. But a home cannot survive on tenderness alone. It also needs courage. It needs someone willing to say, 'This is wrong,' and mean it even when it is inconvenient." Stanley bowed his head. In that room, regret finally found language, but language could not turn back time. Months passed, and the world around the Vaughns changed quietly but completely. Under Victoria's structure, the company stabilized. Workers kept their positions, delayed salaries were corrected, and the constant panic slowly gave way to order. Paul, stripped of illusion, became humbler and more honest. Sandra no longer hosted loud gatherings to prove things to strangers. Her voice softened, her judgments became fewer, and sometimes she sat alone longer than before, as though finally hearing the echo of her own choices. Justina, too, learned that mockery sounds different when pride can no longer afford it. Their world did not end, but it became more truthful, and truth was harder than luxury. Victoria moved forward with quiet strength, never boasting, never retelling the story for applause. She had protected the workers, preserved what could be saved, and walked away from revenge even when it would have been easy. Ken once asked her, "Do you regret loving him?" She thought for a moment and replied, "No, I regret only that he did not know how to be brave when love asked it of him." Stanley remained in the company, earning his place exactly as she had said. He worked harder, spoke less, and carried one lasting lesson in his heart. She had given them all a chance to choose love over money, and they had chosen wrong. We've come to the end of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like, share, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification. Thank you so much for watching.